So welcome, this sort of small group. This is our 11th CFE community chat since April, and it's the first one of our fall engagement series. So again, we know how busy and exhausted everyone is, and we're just so happy that you chose to spend some time with us today. For those of you new to CFE, I'm Sarah Hoppy Knight. I'm the co-executive director of the organization. We're a Chicago-based education nonprofit. We've been around for just over 35 years, supporting and funding CPS educators so that they can best serve their students and grow in their profession. In a typical school year, we award about 400 grants to CPS pre-K through 12th grade educators. This year's a little different. We have a lot of new programming, and we've been just trying at least to be as responsive to the current climate and the needs of our educators and their students. So before we get started, just a few quick notes. If you could mute your microphones throughout the meeting, and if you have specific questions during the presentation, you can either pop them in the chat box and you can send them directly to me, or you can put them out for everyone to see. We'll get through as many as possible through the during the Q&A portion of today's event. And then at the end also, since we have such a small group, you're more than welcome to use that raise your hand function if you'd prefer to ask your question verbally using your own words. Additionally, this call, the meeting is being recorded today and will be posted along with the PowerPoint presentation and any associated resources on our website, a section of our website called the Resource Roundup within the next few days. And please keep an eye out in the chat for some helpful messages sent by our CFE team during today's discussion. So let's get into it. So we have two wonderful presenters today. We are thrilled to have both of them with us. Keisha Rembert is an assistant professor of teacher preparation at National Louis University. She spent over 15 years teaching middle school English and history in the Chicagoland area and was named the 2019 Illinois History Teacher of the Year and 2019 National Council for Teachers of English Outstanding Middle Level English Educator. Her passion for equity, social justice, and youth literature coalesce in her membership and work on the NCTE Committee Against Racism and Bias, as a member of the Assembly on Literature for Adolescents of NCTE Committee for Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion, and in her service on the Illinois Holocaust Museum and Education Center's Educator Advisory Board. So Keisha, we're so grateful to have you. Thanks again for coming.
Thank you.
Yeah, and then Sam Texeira moved to Chicago in 2020 after working in Boston Public Schools, where he taught history, African American studies, and civics at the Dr. William W. Henderson K-12 Inclusion School. While at Henderson, Sam facilitated the school's Strong Men, Strong Leaders organization, an organization dedicated to supporting young men of color with leadership training, community service, and tools to combat negative stereotypes. Sam participated in the first Boston Public Schools Male Educators of Color cohort, was named a winner of the 2019 BPS Educator of the Year award. He currently teaches at Roberto Clemente here in Chicago and sits on the board of City Year Boston. I cannot get over how many accolades you two have between you. It is just such a pleasure to have you, and we're just super thrilled to hear from you today and have a nice discussion. So with that, I will turn it over to Keisha and Sam.
All right, well, let's get this party started. I'm so glad to have poached Sam from Boston to Chicago. We're so lucky to have him here. All right, I am going to share my screen and get going. Uh-oh. As you guys probably all know, when there is technology involved, there are like 5 steps. You want to make sure you get it right. So. And also, I'm always embarrassed by how many tabs I have up on my screen. So, yes. All right, let me make sure you guys can see that. Yes, there are like 1,000 tabs up, seriously. All right, does everyone see the screen? All right, great. So we are here to talk to you today about the voices of the unheard in civics education, using civics education to amplify the marginalized. As you heard a little bit about us, those are topics that are really important to both of us. So we wanted to be able to share that with you. And just a bit, you learned a little bit about who we were, but we wanted to introduce you to ourselves as educators and show you some pictures of the people who make us who we are, and that is our students. So those are my NLU students who mostly were former CPS students and who will be becoming teachers in the next year or so. So they might, you might recognize some of them in your building.
Yeah, well, thank you for having me, Sarah and the Chicago Foundation for Education. Keisha, thank you for inviting me, your phenomenal mentor and thought partner. So one of the things that we wanted everybody to do today was sort of think about this idea of what it is that we exactly believe the purpose of civics education is. I think many of us think about civics and we have an idea of what it is. We know the subject material, but not the actual fundamental purpose that sort of undergirds what it is that we're supposed to actually be teaching our young people. And so there's Amir Levinson quote. Amir Levinson is a professor at Harvard on civics. And one of the things I really like about her is I think very often in this work, we hear professor and like these are people who've never taught before, but she taught in both Atlanta public schools and Boston public schools for 8 years. So her practice or her theory is very much informed by practice. And she says that schools educate civically no matter what. Every single school, whether or not it intends to, is engaged in civic education. Students are learning about who they are in the world, what their roles are, what their responsibilities are, what their rights are, how and whether or not they will be respected, whether it makes a difference to try to make a difference, and what pathways are available to them to try to make a difference, even if the school doesn't intend those things. And so the sort of nature of civics education is whether or not we're intentionally doing it, we're always teaching civics to our students and communicating the ideas of leadership, organization, and all the rest. And one of the things that's also important is that there's a body of research that really tells us that civics education done properly, and not just in high school, but high school, middle school, elementary school, leads to students being stronger civic actors later in life. And that includes voting. It includes joining things like neighborhood associations, PTAs, local school councils. And we also know that there are definitely gaps between the quality of civic education that is received in affluent and predominantly white communities, as well as the quality that's received in working class communities, lower income communities, and communities of color. A couple of other things to keep in mind. During the era of No Child Left Behind, we saw a decline in civics education being offered to young people, particularly students of color in elementary schools. And this was because of the culture sort of testing. We know that high stakes testing is still a factor in our school systems, but we are sort of seeing a reinvigorated interest in civic education. And then there are also 6 components of civics education done right. And this includes multiple classes, not just sort of one check the box class. The ability for students to engage in dialogue and to think about sort of their role in the community as both future leaders, but also as current youth leaders as well.
I'll also add that part of the legislature in Illinois mandated civics instruction for middle grade. So it was mandated in high school, but I believe it was 2 years ago that it became mandated for middle school students to engage in civics education. And I'm hoping that that even filters down, and I hope we don't need a mandate, but that we are able to get civics to even our youngest children. And so when we talk about civics, we could define it so many ways and categorize it so many ways, but we really wanted to share with you what we saw as the ultimate outcomes of civics education on all levels to kind of help us frame our conversation for today. So when we see civics education, we see it as investigation of historical and modern day concepts, practices, people, places, and events, skills, and ideals to promote thoughtful, informed, and actively engaged participants in our democracy. And all of that wording is pretty intentional. I know that I teach a large number of students who are dreamers. And so I purposely did not add the word citizen in that, because I think citizen for them has so many other connotations. And so I want them to understand that they can also engage in civics education just by being participants in our democracy.
Absolutely.
So what does it mean to be marginalized? The title of our session is Voices of the Unheard and Using Civics Education to Amplify the Marginalized, but we might also come from various different ideals in terms of what that might mean. So if you had to, how would you define? You can use the chat feature, you can unmute yourselves. I love that it's an intimate group where we can do that. Unmute yourselves and identify, but what does it mean to be marginalized to you? What does that mean to you? And what do you think are the benefits of bringing marginalized voices into classrooms, and what are the challenges of it? Being left out, absolutely. To be marginalized means to be left out. Pushed aside. Unseen. Okay, I really like that, to be unseen. Because if we think about the word margin, and even if we're thinking about it in terms of a paper, right? You know, we're usually told to stay within the margins, and whatever exists outside of that doesn't exist to us. It's not in our purview to be willfully ignored. Great. And so thinking about that, what do you guys think are the benefits of talking to students about people who are willfully ignored, who are pushed aside, and who are unseen in our classrooms? I know for me, it was like a starting point, and I don't know if it's just because I've always just had this empathy, or if it's because I'm part of a marginalized group myself, that I wanted to feel like I was seen, and so I wanted students to always go from that vantage point. But I agree with you, Beatrice, that it makes you feel connected to that group, and it's a power, and it's a model of leadership also in dominant histories. And a model of resistance. I really like that, because resistance, I believe, is key. And then, so we have all of these things, but I don't think we can sugarcoat the fact that sometimes there are challenges in having a classroom in which you share marginalized voices. Do you all see any challenges in your conversations around marginalized voices? Sam, do you have any challenges where that's concerned?
I can think of a couple. I think one of them is sort of like you. I don't know if it's probably both. My sort of like view of social justice and also being involved in a marginalized group. But I think that sometimes there is a perception that when you center marginalized people in the conversation, that you're somehow trying to impart an agenda. And I think that that conversation is a little bit incomplete, because there already sort of is an agenda at play in terms of like what it is that our students are learning, what history and what sense of civics is sort of prioritized in our curriculum. But more importantly, it's just better history to have a totality of voices. And so I think that pushing back against those who sort of have more, quote, traditional views of civic and historical instruction is one. And I think the other thing is that we have really conditioned young people, including young people of color, including immigrant youth, to really like sort of, quote, in some ways not see race or not see marginalization or not talk about it. And also I think that in some cases there's a shame associated with it. And so some people just frankly don't want to keep talking about it. And I think that that has to be really honored. I think that the challenges definitely look different depending on the school context and the community context, for sure.
Absolutely. I would completely agree. I taught in the suburbs of Chicago, and I was one of two teachers of color in the building, and most of my students didn't look like me. And so there was also this discomfort that my colleagues felt in talking about things that weren't necessarily experiences that they'd had, especially when it came to race. So they could talk about in a story experiences they had, but when it came to like historical things, there was this innate fear that I think exist. And so I think it becomes really important that we challenge ourselves to have conversations and to teach in ways that disrupt and are uncomfortable for us even as educators. So I'll just say that in terms of marginalized. And I see some great comments in the chat too. So this idea of disenfranchisement and it's not my story, so why should I study it? And even like I've heard a lot of teachers express discomfort, even at the university level, about talking about Black Lives Matter. And having to be able to explain that means that you have to first educate yourself. So I think what civics education does is kind of what history does, what American history does. It leads to erasure to some extent. And especially for those people who don't fit the ideal of democracy or who haven't always had access to the process. But students can really learn a lot when looking at a group who has been disenfranchised. So I am going to start talking about who I believe is one of the most erased people groups, and that is First Nations people, also known as Indigenous people and Native Americans. And so I'm going to outline some concepts and some images and primary sources and documents related to this essential question. How has the democratic process disenfranchised and rendered First Nation or Indigenous people invisible in Chicago? So that really is going to be the starting place for me today. I would say that Indigenous people are often left out of the conversation of democracy, and the discussion of their place in our country is relegated, especially in our region, to street names. Chicago is Indigenous, and mascots. And so I think I'm going to versus me saying it, I'm going to let an Indigenous person talk about why civics is important. Uh-oh, Sam, I think you did the thing.
Oh yeah, it's muted, sorry, I'll restart.
You know, well, since I'm in government, it obviously is about our treaties and our constitutions and how tribes came to be. So it's really civics is what it is, you know. And I know it was at last session that there was a bill passed basically for civics to be taught in the public school systems. And a lot of our tribal leaders said, okay, civics for America, great. What about civics for any country? You know, that includes the treaties, that includes, you know, where tribes and tribal nations exist in our U.S. Constitution.
You can stop, thank you. So there's no way to study civics of this nation without studying Indigenous civics, which is at the heart of who we are, and to consider the treaties that the United States entered into with Indigenous people. So if we don't know treaties and sovereignty, then we effectively don't know history. And so I have some questions, and actually there's going to be a poll. If you could pull up, if the poll could be enacted, there are a couple of questions on the poll. So I want you to just test your own knowledge of Indigenous folk here in our region. How many federal or state recognized tribes are there in Illinois? Take a moment and submit an answer to that. Then we'll come back to the results after a bit. And then there's another question. So we've got a series of 3 questions. How many reservations do you think there are here in the state of Illinois? It's another poll question. Thank you for participating. And the last question is, how many First Nation Indigenous people do you think live in the Chicagoland area today? Right, so just something to kind of frame our thinking and to get us thinking, and I'll come back and give you the answers to those questions, but I just wanted us to think about like what we already know. So I see, ooh, it's kind of split between less than 10,000 and 20,000 and over 65. So that's, we've got a vast range of answers there. So that's just something to think about in terms of our understanding, our even adult understanding of Indigenous education. So I'm going to be talking, I'm going to be going back and forth as if I am a teacher in the classroom, but also as a learner. So bear with me as I outline certain things. What I love to do when I'm in the classroom is to start with music. I think it's a great opener. I think it's a great level of engagement for all levels of learner. So Sam, if you play this, this piece, it is by Buffy St. Marie, and we'll listen to the excerpt of this song.
Who taught the pilgrims how to make it in the wild? Who sings a 49er rock and roll changes? We native North American child. Sing about your ebony African queen. Sing about your lily white lily Marlene. Beauty by the bushel, but the girl of the hour is a native North American American flag. Sailing on the Atlantic bayou, Shoshone. Navajo, Comanche, Hopi, Eskimo, Cree. Tuscarora,
Stop it, Sam.
all night.
Thank you.
Native North American me. Sing
So,
about everybody.
thinking about that song, were there any parts of it that stood out to you? Any lyrics that you heard overall that were familiar or unfamiliar, or that were shocking? There were a couple that were shocking to me. Were there any, Sam, were there any shocking lyrics for you or things that stood out to
One of
you?
the things that I think that stood out for me was the fact that she named multiple tribes and nations. And one of the things that I just got through teaching the discovery, obviously in quotes, of Quisqueya, which we know is the Dominican Republic and Haiti by Columbus, and what that meant. One of the things that I've often taught children or young people that they're confused about is that there were Native Americans there, and that Native Americans existed from Alaska all the way down to South America, and that they're not all one group. And so if I were teaching this, or if I were playing that song, which I never heard until this, I would definitely draw students' attention to that.
Okay. So it was hard to understand her, but she talks about your ebony African queen, she makes references to all of these things, and then she talks about, but who kind of birthed this? Who was the origin of these beings? Who helped people survive? And she said it was the Native American native child. And then she does go into talking about these various tribes, some of which I hadn't heard before. And I think it would be interesting to see the ones that the students hadn't heard before. And I think this is in the 70s. I think her song is from the 70s, but I can double check that, Brandy. I think it was around the time of Indian relocation or redistribution back to the cities. But I would challenge students, okay, what tribal groups have you heard and which ones have you not? And do you know how many tribal groups exist right now? Thank you. 1972, I thought it was in the 70s, before my time, if you'll believe that. So I would start just activating their thinking and their knowledge through that song. And then we start talking about, let's start this investigation at looking at how the government has civically engaged with First Nation people. And this could be an investigation that we do whole class. It could be done in small groups. It could be done with a map where students shade the map of Chicagoland. After every treaty is read, shade areas where Native American land that Native Americans gave up. So there are 5 treaties here that really local treaties that impacted Indigenous people in the Chicagoland area. The first one was the Treaty of Greenville, and it was the Treaty of Greenville, Ohio, but Ohio at that point stretched into land that is present day Illinois. And in that treaty, the mouth of the Chicago River and parts of the Des Plaines River and the mouth of the Illinois River were given over to the American government in that Treaty of 1795. In the Treaty of 1816, which is the Treaty of St. Louis, they acquired control, the government acquired control over the Chicago River corridor linking Lake Michigan and the Mississippi River. And in the Treaty of 1821, the Potawatomi signed a treaty giving up land in southwestern Michigan and gave them permission to build a road, the government permission to build a road from Detroit to Chicago. In 1829, there was granted sections of land along the Chicago and Des Plaines River. Remember, they'd given up control of the river, and now the lands around those rivers have also been ceded to the American government. And the big Treaty of Chicago, 1833, is when the Potawatomi cedes the last of their Illinois and Wisconsin land and the last reservation that they had in Michigan to the American government. And they were sold 5 million acres of Great Lakes land. So those 5 treaties, what they do is they effectively displace the majority of indigenous people in the state of Illinois. And that's a huge conversation for students, right? So to get them thinking and wondering, where do the indigenous people go after that? What I have here on this slide are 2 maps, and they're kind of connected to the polls that you did. So looking at this map, one is the indigenous trails and highlights in green where tribes lived in Chicagoland in 1804. And the other is a more recent map from the government outlining reservations in Illinois and federal land in the state. What observations can you make based on these 2 maps? Anything that you noticed immediately? I look at the green areas here. So the green areas are where indigenous people lived in the Chicagoland area. This map, if it were dark blue, would identify where reservation land is. So I hope you notice that there are no reservations here in Illinois. There are no federally or state reservations. There are no state or federally recognized tribes in the state of Illinois right now. And that is, I think that would be shocking for our students to know and to understand. What does it mean to be federally recognized? Also, to be able to delve into that idea, and what does it mean to not have reservations on land that people at one point owned 5 million acres of in the Chicagoland area alone. The Native American population at the end of the 20th century was about 40,000. With relocation, our current population in the Chicagoland area is around 65,000, and it's the 3rd largest in the of urban areas in the country, which I didn't know. That was learning for me. So the next thing that I'm asking you to do, guys, is what are your thoughts and wonderings about that? Having learned the total number of federally and state recognized tribes, think about the idea that we have no reservations, and that number of indigenous people that live in the Chicagoland area. Are there any wonderings that you all have? Sam, any that you have?
Something that comes out to mind, and I mean, I guess this would be a conversation with ideally a community of indigenous people, is probably the irony that's felt about being like federally recognized, that it comes with certain like benefits and it comes with a perception of being official. But on the other hand, you're being officially federally recognized by a government that is responsible for your eradication and marginalization. And so I think, a general question of like, what does justice look like in that case?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And then like thinking what was in those treaties, like what enticed people to give up their homeland to the American government.
You know, it's funny you say that, because when I used to teach about the Indian Removal Act, one of the big debates there was about whether, or many of the Cherokee leaders had signed on believing that even though this isn't a good thing, this is better for the protection of our community in the long run. And so thinking about having to make those kind of decisions under duress and what that really means for both the community and probably the pushback that happens as well.
Absolutely. And I see in the chat too, like not knowing that the population was so high. I didn't know that either. The fact that there are 65,000 who live, I know someone just identified the American Indian Center in Uptown, who live in that kind of uptown area, but do identify tribe as Native, as Indigenous, not as something else, but identify as First Nation people. And I'll talk to you about a little bit about what that looks like today. So here were some of my wonderings. If you click, you will see why has Illinois not recognized tribes, and what does the process of acknowledgement look like, and what does that mean to Indigenous people to be acknowledged? And how does Illinois compare in terms of tribal recognition and reservations to neighboring states? Was this something that was, the fact that we have no reservations, is that something that's commonplace in Wisconsin and Michigan, in Missouri, as they also have had a large number of Indigenous people. And that moves us to, so we know that Indigenous people move out of Illinois, but in the 1950s, there is this push to relocate, or to, and you probably heard the term, kill the Indian, save the man. This idea of bringing Indigenous people back into the fold and reintegrating them, and I use that word with air quotes, reintegrating them into American society. And what it really was a termination, really, of Indigenous ideology. And so the government imposed this Indian Relocation Act. And here's some images from Chicago, which I think would be fascinating for students to look at. So these are the flyers that are supposed to entice Indigenous folk to come back to the Chicago area. And I could see my students really delving into the pictures and doing a really good see, think, wonder about what they see in these images. And is it enticing overall for people to come back, and looking at this document and what in here is akin to our democratic process, and what is democracy? How does democracy look versus sovereignty? Because if I leave my reservation, I'm leaving this idea of being a sovereign nation to come into something that is a democracy, which might be foreign to me. And does it serve me? Is it appropriate for me? So thinking about it in those terms, and talking about what it means to assimilate a group. What does it mean to really have a group assimilate? What are we ultimately saying? I'll play this clip. Oh, is that the next one?
I don't. Yeah, it was. Hold on.
I feel like
Oh, you know what? Okay, is that it?
Yep. This is it. So Chicago is.
Oh, sorry.
No, don't worry. Go for it.
So play it?
Yep.
Okay.
The Youth Council wrote a resolution to get passed from the City Council that acknowledges Chicago as an indigenous landscape. So to have a resolution like this is amazing, because a lot of the times urban Indians are often looked over, and a lot of people don't know that there are such thing as urban Indians.
The Chicago City Council's lawyer, who works for Mayor Rob Manuel, and chairman of the finance committee at Burke, both said that they did not want to pass the resolution if it included a clause talking about genocide and displacement. And so unfortunately, in order to pass the resolution at this month's city council meeting, we had to remove that clause.
Okay, so I'll kind of do a little backtrack. So basically what I'm doing is walking through the different ways in which civics has impacted Indigenous people in Chicagoland. And so I have this, I know that students conceive of Indigenous people as people of the past, and they often don't think of Indigenous people as existing and thriving today. And so this is a clip that I think highlights that ability of Indigenous people to really try to right the wrongs of some of those treaties, and to think that this resolution, the city resolution in 2018, was passed to acknowledge that Chicago is ancestral Indigenous land, and that this was spearheaded by a group of young Indigenous people. I think they're called Shy Youth Nations, and in collaboration with the American Indian Center. And that in that process, what they learned was that that resolution would be passed, but with concessions. And those concessions being the idea that the truth of the history could not truly be revealed, that there were some words that had to be left out. And I think that would be a powerful practice to have students engage in and think about. Thanks, Sam. Mm-hmm. Go to the next one. And this is just a copy of the resolution that was before the city. And I would have my students look at it for keywords and key ideas and really dissect it and talk about where they might have, so they heard in the video that there were words taken out, where might those words have gone and how might they have changed the meaning overall? And so are there any wonderings at this time? Anyone in the group have any wonderings about any of what I've shared so far? Okay, here are some of my wonderings. Why were historical truths removed from the resolution, and what does that tell us? And what is the purpose and power of a resolution? So if I would probably talk to my students very specifically about, okay, this resolution is a flat document. It's just a piece of paper. Why was it yeah, okay, so you didn't know that Ron was doing that in 2018. And why was so you have a resolution that's just this flat piece of paper. Why is it so meaningful? Why is it meaningful to have this resolution on the books? And how does this resolution reconcile or not reconcile the essential question of being disenfranchised? So thank you for that. And then this is a video from the American Indian Center. And I also always want to end with celebration and the words of Indigenous people themselves.
Sorry.
Because our people are very strong and very devoted to community and family and traditions. And I think that's one of the main components for its survival. And we're not ever going to be without those values. So I think it's going to last another 50 years at least.
So just this idea that Native people still exist and they thrive within our community, and know, regardless of the things that have been enacted by our government to erase and disenfranchise them, they are still here and they're still thriving, and we cannot erase a people from our history.
That was incredible. Thank you.
You're welcome. Any thoughts, questions? Okay. I had just some thoughts. Why is it important for students to know this? How could this fit into our curriculum? And are there questions and concerns that you guys might have about any of what I shared? It is such a large knowledge gap. I agree. I don't think we talk enough about Indigenous people in civics, and I think it's because people don't have an entry point for it.
Right.
Okay, well, we'll come back to questions. I know Sam has, I'm like ready to buckle my seatbelt up for Sam's part, so.
All right, well, thank you. That was really enlightening, Keisha, thank you. So we intentionally had Keisha go first because hers was obviously sort of started in the 19th century and then took us to the 20th. And that's what we're gonna focus on today, the 20th century, and particularly Chicago's Black community, and what marginalization had historically meant and currently means, and how at a time in Chicago's history, Black folks civically organized in order to sort of combat this marginalization. And so the questions that I would lead, similar to Keisha, I'll kind of talk through my strategies as a teacher. We'll have some time for you all to speak as well. Because I can't see the chat, Keisha, would you just tell me if anybody knows anything? And please feel free to stop me if at all, or put anything in the chat. So there are questions that are sort of leading us for today, and that would lead me if I were to do a unit, would be what civic lessons did the 1983 mayoral election of Harold Washington teach us? The second one would be, how can we use the events of the 1983 mayoral election to teach civics in our classroom? And then lastly, what does the election of Harold Washington tell us about Black Chicago's past, present, and future? Because this was not sort of just like, events aren't isolated in history, as we know. And so there's a lot of civic lessons on sort of both ends of this one event in 1983. So I'm not going to read the entire quote just in the interest of time, and plus Harold Washington has this style of oratory that really can't be matched. I'm going to play him saying this. And so as we think about, or as we watch this, I do want you all to just think of two questions in your head that you, or two responses to two questions. One, what kind of man was Harold Washington? And then two, in this particular instance, who is he talking to and how do we know? And I might show this, I might do this with my students as well, have them thinking about a specific historical figure as a human being, because oftentimes we think about people in relation to their moments in history, but just as a person.
I think your mayor is a wonderful fellow, but I depart radically from him when he says that he would hope that I would have all the good qualities of past mayors. There are no good qualities of past mayors to be had. None, 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 none.
Stand by me. When the storms of
I believe in the powers of redemption, and I simply cannot believe in the God I worship that he would permit us to sit on this earth for 400 years, or rather in this country for 400 years, and suffer the indignities which we have suffered, piled time after time, high after high, and so heavy it has almost broken the backs of one of the most powerful people in this world. I can't believe there is no redemption. But that redemption is not going to come out in hatred. It's going to come out in positive attitude toward our fellow man.
We want Washington! 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 Just keep on talking to me like a ship out on the raging sea.
We have no explanations to give to anybody. We don't have to explain our existence. We don't have to explain the thing that we want to, a part of the political power of this country, not to suppress anybody, but to add our good. We've come into the 1980s with an understanding that we have not just a right, but a responsibility to give the best that we have to a society. We want to give it, and we're going to give it if we have to beat them across the head, knock them down, and make them take it. We're going to give it to them.
Okay, so I'm going to stop there. What kind of man was he? Or in this particular instance, from some of the campaign footage, who is he talking to? Feel free to either speak out loud or put it in the chat. And I also have a shortened quote here just for reference as well.
He's talking to Black people, is what someone said in the chat. And I said I didn't remember, I forgot how quote unquote radical he was. Unapologetically Black, yes.
At one quote, it sounded like he was talking to some white, like, press guy, you know, maybe, you know, somebody asked about, are you gonna be like our mayor, you know, or something like that.
Right,
It
yeah.
sounded like it was like a racial thing, you know?
Would you have the good qualities of the former mayor? So sort of implying Daley or Byrne before, yeah. So I agree, Keisha. Hearing it, it's funny because he is sort of, or whomever said that, very like radical, very unapologetically Black. And it's almost funny because I wonder, like, you don't necessarily hear that from politicians who are sort of like major city politicians today. And so in many ways, while we may have progressed in some ways racially, maybe there's sort of open questions about what does that progress look like or what has been compromised. And actually, I think that that would be a really interesting discussion with students. There's a question I have at the end that will allude to that as well in our civic and political culture. So one of the things that's really important is before we think about the movement that elects Harold Washington, we have to think about how Black folks get to Chicago. And so teaching the Great Migration is really important. One of the things that's also, I think, a really beautiful part of living in Chicago and teaching this to students who are Black or African American is that many of their own families connect to this. And so a couple of weeks ago, I was teaching about the Great Migration, and I had several students offer up their own experiences that their grandparents had come from Mississippi. And in both circumstances were fleeing violence. And so when I spoke earlier about the fact that in some ways there's a point of pride in who we are and talking about this sort of thing, there are also people for whom there are very traumatic memories. And I think it's important to keep that in mind as well. But needless to say, I include the Defender, which was a very prominent Black newspaper in Chicago. It was actually the largest in the country, and it was nationally, not disseminated, circulated. And so this paper is literally encouraging Black people to come to the northern cities like Detroit, Chicago, Cleveland, Pittsburgh. And Chicago happens to be the largest city on the Great Migration. A lot of people don't know this, but there are 6 million Black folks that moved from the South to the North and the West between these years. And this was the largest mass migration of people in American history, bar none, in our own country. And so making sure to teach those sort of political messages about why that happens and what specifically Black people are looking for when they leave the South and come to the North. And in some ways they're able to achieve those things and to earn those things and to get those things. And in many ways they're not.
And to just think too, I heard somebody say it, that, you know, we don't often speak of it in terms of Black folks leaving the terror of the South. So there was that they were being terrorized in the South, and they were leaving that terror-ridden environment to come someplace that they felt was safe.
Yeah, in fact, if you're looking for a really good resource to show students a really compelling video, if you YouTube Facing History and Ourselves, Paula Giddings' lynchings, she talks about that, this sort of like literally day-to-day terror that people are enduring. It's a phenomenal video. And it really opens up the sort of understanding of how lynching was not originally racialized until after the Civil War and Reconstruction. So very powerful video. So many of us might be familiar with the 1919 Red Summer. Red Summer is happening all across America, but Chicago happens to be the most violent, both in terms of like casualties, deaths, arsons. And what's really important is that Black folks are coming to the North. A lot of white men had left for Europe in World War I. And so Black people have in some ways started to get a footing in the North, and then they're losing their jobs. And so what essentially happens is that in Chicago, people are just tired of it and they start fighting back. And there becomes this sort of radicalization that happens after 1919. And it's in part because of the large population of Black people in Chicago. And it's also in part because of how hyper-segregated Chicago is. That if you are Black in Chicago at the time, you can essentially live in your own community, not necessarily deal with white people day to day. And that's not necessarily as prominent in other sort of major cities at the time. And so when I show students these images, you know, we might do think, pair, shares, or see, think, wonders. But the other thing that's important is that what's also forged in sort of Black political Chicago in the 20th century are also these images. And it's important to combat the negative images with the positive, because there is a reason that Black folks are moving to Chicago in these large numbers, 500,000. And so I might even ask my students to do things like narrate a conversation that might be happening in these communities. And so these are very stably middle-class Black communities in Chicago in the 1950s, 1960s. very sort of sophisticated, and also very well politically organized. And this is very, very important, that these were a very politically organized people, because you don't get Harold Washington 1983 without decades of work beforehand. And so things like the Bud Billiken Parade still happen in Chicago. Bronzeville looks profoundly different than it did in the 50s, but bringing in sort of the labor movement and A. Philip Randolph and who he was. There's a lot of different angles that can be directed with this. We also start to see emergence of more radical voices in the 60s in Chicago. People like Fred Hampton, the Black Panthers. At this point, the sort of legislative accomplishments of Dr. King are enacted. And so Dr. King decides to move to the north, and he says, we're gonna start in Chicago with the open housing movement. And so another two documents, one relates to the idea of like Black cooperative economics, keeping money in the community. Remember, this, the South Side of Chicago for a very long time, and arguably still today, is the largest Black community nationally. Meaning, like, yes, New York might have more Black people, but they're all over different boroughs. At this time, there's 1 million Black people in this city. And so the idea is there's buying power, and we can keep this here in the community. And so talking to young people about what that means, what are cooperative economics, and why is that important in a political system. There's the emergence of more sort of slums on the South Side. We start to see that. And so we start to see a radicalization of Black people who are no longer sort of just happy with the way things had been for the last 5 decades or so. An activity that I'm doing in my class, feel free to replicate it, is we're looking at, for my IB students, these sort of radical movements. And one of the things that's important is that in any civic or political movement, there's always a diversity of opinion. So it's not as simple as, well, there's Martin Luther King and there's radicals. Quote, these radicals have different views on things. And so I'm assigning my students to different, to take on different individuals within this, within the classroom, within this sort of time frame, late 60s, early 70s. And we're having a sort of forum as if it were 1969, and the students are able to enact these roles. And so in thinking about connecting this to civics, it's discussion-based, it's deliberation, and it's also a simulation of adult civic role models, or excuse me, civic roles.
Sam, can I jump in?
Yeah,
I love that, because then students, very often students think in terms of good or bad and not the complexities of a person. And to be able to have that conversation, you have to think about the complexities of a person and not just attribute them to one or the other.
Right, right. And that's funny, that's actually a component of what they have to do in advance, is sort of look up this person's biography. One of the things that we forget to think about in history is asking, like, what was this person like as an individual, and what may have shaped his or her views on things. So one of the things that's really important is that the Daily Machine realizes that it can't ignore Black folks at a certain point in the 20s. And so they start to give Black people pieces of the puzzle, some city jobs, because you have 1 million people in your city and you can't completely ignore them. And so what this causes is many Black folks are actually supportive of the Daily Machine for a very long time, knowing that it's also the only game in town. The other thing that's important is that Black people were Republicans from after the Civil War until the 1930s. And so the Daily Machine realizes, well, the political infrastructure in Chicago, even before the Daily Machine, realizes that. And they're trying to woo Black people to the Democratic Party in Chicago specifically. And so keeping this in mind, this is very important, because this is what in many ways sort of is a boon to Chicago's Black middle class. Public sector professional jobs have always sort of been or Black folks have always been overrepresented in public sector jobs in terms of the middle class. And so this is very important. However, after World War II, we start to see white folks leave the city. And so Daley is walking this tightrope, because he wants to keep white people in the city, but he doesn't necessarily want to support the Black community here in Chicago. But he also knows, well, he can't be seen as sort of an outright bigot, as if he were, you know, down south. And so he's walking this very fine line, because this is a very changing time in American society. It's still a very racist time profoundly, but he's, I think, in my estimation, probably sort of taking the political calculus and deciding, well, at this point, you know, my majority is white, I'm sticking with them, I'm going to do what they want. However, I can't have Black people sort of get out of line. So I have to give them some crumbs, which is why he capitulates to King in some ways.
Sam, there's a question about just like the total population of like Black folk. You mentioned 1 million Black folk.
So Chicago right now is 2.7 million people. 1950 was like the high point, like I think 3.5 million. And that's true of most cities. And that's before suburbanization actually happens. So then the population declines. Up through the 80s, there were 3 million people in Chicago. Chicago, up until 84, was the second largest city in the United States. And so it's been declining since the 80s. And so right now it's 2.7 million.
Thank you.
Yeah, of course. So Black folks are frustrated with lack of political responsiveness, and they realize we want to put somebody forward, but we can't split our votes. We have to coalesce as a community. The Black community in Chicago is very different. The South Side is huge. The professional class is very different than poor Black folks, who are very different than Black folks on the West Side, who hadn't really known Harold. And so Black communities and organizations, as well as progressive white organizations with whom Harold had a lot of sort of pull, decide we're going to coalesce around one candidate, and we're going to put Harold up for election in 1983 as the Black candidate, as the progressive candidate, and is really the candidate who can take advantage of the demographics of our city and of this race, the dynamics of this race, and win. Before, Jane Byrne had been mayor, and a lot of Black folks supported her as this anti-machine person, but similar to Daley, she sort of capitulated and decided that she was going to prioritize white folks over Black folks in the city. And so Washington says, you know, I'm not going to run. I actually need to see some numbers. If you all can get me 50,000 people registered here in Chicago on the South Side, then I will run, because then it'll be a worthwhile endeavor. And so the groups actually grassroots organize and get 100,000. And so Black Chicago, it's very funny, used a lot of the tools that the Daley machine had used for like decades. So there were landlords on the South Side with empty apartment buildings, and they would give them the keys and say, you know what, organize people there. We don't have any tenants, go right ahead. Or they wooed like Black letter carriers, for example, things that had been done for decades in Chicago politics. And they said, deliver our mail. We don't have the money for it, but please deliver it free of charge. And one of his advisors kind of laughed about it and said, like, the statute of limitations is over, so I feel comfortable talking about it, but this is just Chicago politics. Chicago politics ain't beanbag, quite frankly. So Harold Washington wins the election. One of the things I think is really important in civics is showing students electoral maps. This is an incredibly interesting one, because many of the sort of the places that went for the Republican candidate had actually been Democratic strongholds for a very long time. And so having the conversation with students about why that is. Chicago's population was essentially like 40-40-15 in 1980. And so the two white candidates, Jane Byrne and State's Attorney Daley, split the vote. Washington carries Black voters in large numbers, carries Latino voters in large numbers, and sort of like lakefront white liberals as well. So I pulled two documents. One was a national paper. I forget, this isn't the Chicago Sun-Times. I forget which one. And the other was also from the 80s, and it tracks the winning margins. And so the first question I might ask students is, Chicago's a strongly Democratic city and has been for a long time. 6 of the 8 mayoral elections before Washington, the Democrat received over 70%. Why didn't Washington? And so helping students to think about race, helping students to think about the differences between a primary election and a general election. There's a lot of ways that you can sort of go with this. Asking students, obviously I told you, but if they read this article, what are the different ethnic and racial coalitions that are responsible for Harold's victory? And this sort of harder question is, does he owe certain things to certain communities that supported him? Should he say, well, the Black community really put me here, and so I owe more to them? Washington was actually very sensitive about this, because he wanted to be a mayor for everybody, despite never winning a majority of the white vote. And this idea that Washington is committed to bipartisanship, despite only getting 18% of the white vote in the general. What do we make of this? And does white support of Black candidates genuinely mean progress for marginalized communities? In what ways does it? In what ways does it not? I think there's a lot of different ways, sort of higher level conversations we can have with our students about this. I know I'm talking. Are there any questions or anything? I know
Nope, none in the chat yet.
Thinking about the role of the legislative and the judicial branch. I think a lot of our students think of legislative branch as Congress, forgetting that at our local levels, there is a legislative branch as well. So the Verdoli Act 29, this is a group of city council members, and they're sort of committed to stalling Washington's agenda. There's 29 of them and 21 of Washington's allies. And so asking students the question of, is this traditional party politics or is this actually racial? One of the things that's interesting is there's a great podcast called Making Obama. And in episode 2, some of Washington's staff actually says, we don't think this is racial. We think that they're playing on race, but it's traditional politics. Some thought this was overtly racial. And so hearing the differences of opinions around those who are around Washington and then giving it to students and then thinking about parallels to this in their own lives. Well, our own, I guess, President Obama, I'd say. And then, of course, the judicial branch and the success of, a judicial victory, the idea that the wards were overturned, that they had been ruled unconstitutional because they had, after the 1980 census, not adequately represented Black communities or Latino communities. And so a federal judge essentially threw it out, required an election. And this not only ends the council wars, but it actually increases representation of Black and brown communities here in Chicago. And so helping students think about the role of the judicial branch in rectifying social injustice throughout our time and even up to the present. I love political cartoons. I think that they speak volumes and they help students. And so thinking about gerrymandering, something that is still really very intentionally going on in communities of color in the country. I think that this is very important then. It's important at the local level and the national level. And so whether you're teaching this or not, having students think about this. Students instinctively know that the South side is the Black side. So long as they know South, North, East, and West, they can look at this and probably draw some conclusions about what might be going on in our cartoon. And so finally, Washington dies, and I think that these are phenomenal images for helping young people understand how much passion was involved in this race and in Washington's mayoralty. I can't think of anything like this happening at a local level in 2020. And I don't know that we'll ever have somebody with Washington's charisma, but I mean, these are, high school students, to have them think about what this meant for high school students to come out and salute the mayor, but also the limits. And so I have this, I love this image on the left because it makes me think about sort of the future of Chicago. When this young man met Harold Washington, and I assume today he'd probably be well in his 40s. But essentially, one of the problems was that there was so much investment in this goal of having Washington elected that the progressive steam and the steam of communities of color to coalesce around a movement sort of ended when Harold Washington died very tragically of a heart attack. And so helping students to think that our civic goals have to go beyond the idea of electing a single individual person. And that if that is the sort of end all be all, then that ends when that person is either not reelected or passes away, unfortunately. That we have to continue activism, and our activism can't be about one individual or one election. And so the sort of final questions that I would leave my students with, and that I might leave you all with, is there are no longer a Democratic and Republican primary in Chicago politics. Some think that this was done to prevent communities of color from supporting one candidate, and others think that this is better because this means that a candidate has to get broad appeal across the city, putting that question to students. There are 250,000 less Black people here in Chicago than there were 20 years ago. What does that mean for Chicago's Black political future? And what does it mean that we have doubled the percentage of Latinos in our city in the last 30 plus years? And what are the limits and the possibilities of sort of a Black-Brown coalition with progressive whites as well happening in our city? Is that even a possibility, or are we so far past that point? In the year 2020, what are the political concerns or policy agendas that can motivate Black voters? And really, are there? I think that's an important question too. Are there any policies that can sort of motivate us, or are we sort of like any community? We have different positions on things, different interests, and that's maybe easier done when you're uniting behind a candidate versus a set of issues or a movement. And then finally, what are the benefits or constraints of electoral politics? This sort of inside-outside game that not many candidates can do, but Washington was very, very, very skilled at. And asking really, are you compromised by being on the inside game? So there are several resources I've linked, highly recommend all of them. Whether or not you teach civics, they're really good. A book, several books, a podcast, and one of them is actually an interactive website as well that goes over not just Chicago's Black political history, but the Black history in Chicago more broadly. So if there are questions, I'm happy to take them, but I know we're probably close on time.
Sam, that was awesome.
Thank you
so much.
Thank you both. This is definitely the best civics class I've ever been in. So thank you both. It's fascinating, both stories, and we really appreciate the resources and everything that you shared with us today. Are there questions? Do folks have questions you'd like to ask Keisha and Sam here today? Yes. So this is being recorded and will be shared both on our resource roundup on our website, and then also it's something we can share via email, just the link. So I think Kayla will pop the link into the chat. So that that link, once we have the presentation edited and ready to post, it'll be available there along with the resources. So we have a ton of resources, obviously, that were shared in the presentation itself. And so we hopefully will be able to share that presentation if that's okay with you both. And then there were a couple books in particular around Keisha's discussion about Indigenous populations that we will share, and that sort of thing. So there's a lot to discover, a lot to explore.
I'll answer. Can I jump in with one of the questions?
Yeah.
The most surprising reaction from students is that Indigenous people still exist in Chicagoland, in the Chicagoland area. So they're like, well, where do they live? I think they still expect Indigenous people to live in traditional ways and not live among us. And that's why I love to show the shy youth and to acknowledge that they're still here and they live among us and they still hold true to their traditional values, but also to, but it exists in modernity with us all. I haven't had any Indigenous students, although my nephews are Indigenous, but I haven't had any Indigenous students. And I haven't had students challenge any of my facts. I'm sure Sam has, thinking about that lesson.
I have had students definitely ask why I talk about race a lot. I've had students push back, but never outright challenge the facts.
Mm-hmm. And I think it's in the way that you frame it, right? It's in the way that you have the discussion when you have documented primary sources and a collection of things that students can't refute that are part of history. And also, I'm not telling my students. Part of this is inquiry. So I'm not giving my students my opinion. I'm asking them to pull from the documents themselves and draw conclusions. So as you noted, when I was doing mine, I stopped often and asked, what are you wondering? So students are constantly thinking and questioning what they have in front of them. And I think that's one of the greatest parts of civics. It's an investigation, right? So I'm not lecturing. I am giving them the opportunity to draw conclusions for themselves. But while also, and I'll give this caveat because I think teachers make the mistake of allowing students to draw conclusions and then get to the wrong conclusion. So I will steer my students away from those points that don't make sense, or if they hold bias, views that are prejudiced, I will move them away from those views with fact. But I do allow them ultimately to come to this place that makes sense with the evidence that I presented to them.
I agree with that, specifically in terms of like having I think the ability to have students like openly dialogue about things allows where students don't necessarily have to feel like they have to challenge you. And I think that that's really important in civics. Most of the questions that we should be asking students are open-ended. And I think that the other thing is that a lot of the questions that I put up, the sort of open-ended inquiry-based questions, I don't even have my own answer to as a 31-year-old. It's something that as a political science student and as a teacher, I've thought about and my views have shifted. And I think that it's important to explain that to students. I've always taught a majority of students of color. I've had very few white students in my career, but that doesn't mean that they don't have ideological difference and very varying perspectives about this idea of what liberation is and could look like, and whether or not politics are important or an avenue for liberation. And so I think that if questions are open to students and if there's a culture of inquiry, then generally speaking, all students should be willing to sort of put what they think out there, even if it does challenge the teacher, but obviously fact-based.
Mm-hmm. And I taught 15 years in Naperville, and I had a handful of students of color. And I still think I would teach Sam's lesson in a heartbeat there. And I hope that we don't relegate lessons based on their message.
Right.
Can I ask both of you, just in terms of where we are right now with everything, predominantly being remote, how are you engaging your students at the collegiate level, at the high school level, in this type of work, in civics, in the upcoming election, the ongoing strife politically in our country, everything else that's going on that's sort of wrapped around it? How have you found ways to be really engaged and continue to keep your students engaged in the work and the conversation when everyone's like this instead of in person?
Well, one of the things I think is that this actually gives us a very unique moment to be able to have conversations about this. And I think that because the reality is the work output that's happening in schools right now is just not the same as it would be in person. And so you have to really be intentional about what work you're giving students, and you have to really think about, why is it that I want this student to complete this activity? Like, there's really not, if we're trying to get students, we're trying to be, at least in my experience, we're trying to be as sort of engaging as possible. And I think that we're just not really in a space where, obviously I don't speak for all teachers, but to be able to sort of give busy work. And so I think that now is really the time to be able to have the conversations. So my school, I'm sure, is different than others, and everybody has a different sort of schedule. But one of the benefits that we have is a hour and 40-minute block schedule. And so that gives us a lot of time for students to do asynchronous, independent work, but also a lot of time to just sort of check in about what's going on. We knew that there was going to be profound trauma this past summer from just being inside the house for a long time, not being able to socialize for a while, the racial unrest and the violence that was happening in the summer. And so we wanted to create a space to be able to talk about that. And so we invested a lot of time in talking about that. And I think that as somebody who's very open about my views, I always tell my students, you can believe whatever you want, you won't be penalized, but I'm going to say what I believe, because I think that it's important for young people to know where I'm sort of coming from. And I think that hearing my views on things kind of opens up the ability for other students to talk. I'm thinking back to the Breonna Taylor verdict for the 3 officers who were involved, and Chicago sent us resources to talk about it. And I remember I sort of put it out to the students, would anybody like to say anything? I always want my students to go first so that they don't think I'm putting my thumb on the scale. And when nobody did, I sort of said my view. And frankly, I was curious about what was going on. And I think that sort of then caused other students to open up and to share their thoughts on things. And in one class, we spoke for an entire hour straight. In one class, frankly, didn't want to talk about it. There were students who put things in the chat, but they were exhausted about it. And I think we have to be very honest that both of those things do happen and do exist. But I think that this is probably the best time to get talking about civics to young people. I think the drawback is that one of the challenges of virtual is that, in any given class, I have 6 people talking, right? I don't know what the other 20 are doing. I'm not saying they're not doing work, because I have no clue what's going on. We can't judge, but I'm not able to see how much of the class this is actually being engaged or is being engaged with. But I genuinely, definitely think that this has allowed us more time and space to be able to talk about this, because we can't really not talk about the moment. We're doing this virtually. It would be a little strange to not acknowledge like how weird things are and what's going on in our society, to at least come to some sort of like normal point of, all right, we're all experiencing this, even though we might not all be in the same room.
I completely agree with that point. So for me, and I'm in a different space, so my students are at the point where they can vote, right? They're starting that process of being part of, engaged in the democratic process. And so I can, and the news is, there's a plethora of opportunities to talk about civics in the news every day. So I've found the ability to bring in little snippets of news clips, or the New York Times and the Washington Post have these graphics on Twitter that they use, and I brought those into the classroom and been able to have that as a starter, even if that's not what my lesson is about, because I believe that civics should be taught every day in every class. So even if that's not what I'm talking about, we start there. And then I'm of the opinion that history is now, history is past, history is now, and history is yet to come. So I can make those connections all the way around in the classroom. And I find that students, it's a welcome diversion, or not even diversion, it's a welcome opportunity to cut through a lot of the rhetoric and things that they are hearing right now, and giving them a space and time to process it. So in this remote space, I find engagement is high because they can enter into this conversation. And I also think, and maybe this is just me being too over analytical, they don't have to worry about body language, right? Because I'm only, most of them I'm not seeing their face, and some of them I'm only seeing this. So I think there's a freedom of being able to say what they want to say without this, without having to couch it or, or draw back if they were in the classroom. So I think that is kind of the beauty of being remote.
Well, it's clear to me that you're both really embracing the moment and the opportunities that you're having as civics instructors and drivers of this work. We are so incredibly thankful that you both came. I know it's, again, I said this at the beginning, but it's, these days can be really exhausting and really tough and really challenging for everybody, and especially educators. And we are so thankful that you both took the time to prepare everything that you did and share all of this with us and pose these thought-provoking, wonderful questions. I know most of us, if not all of us, will continue to think about all of this for, not just tonight, many days and weeks, and, long into the future. So
I just want to say thank you for the teachers who came after teaching, also who came after teaching a long day. Like, being in front of a screen is, I'm sure, not what you want to do. And I've become the queen of signing up for stuff that I don't attend. So I know that to actually attend something is major. So thank you guys for coming and giving us the audience.
Well, thank you so much for that. You couldn't have said it better myself. So thanks again. And we will send out a note tomorrow, just again, with the resource roundup link. And then that will give you access to everything that we saw tonight. And then we'll have a little post-chat survey that's just helpful for us as we continue on this fall engagement series and, want to provide our educators with everything they need and want, and just be as supportive as we possibly can be. So CFE is here for you. We have been here for all of these months and trying to provide the most responsive work possible. And we will continue to do that. And everything we do is truly in response to what our educators tell us they need and what we're seeing and hearing and reading and talking about. So thanks again, everyone. And I hope you all have wonderful evenings. Keisha and Sam, thank you again so much. We are just delighted. It was wonderful. So thank you all.
Thanks for joining me, Sam.
All right, thank you. Have a good night, everybody.